Hi, I'm Jayne Turk, and this is Let's Talk Turkey. We are working on our introduction to mass media. Glad you're here. So, I was doing my typical beach stroll one day, and it's a perfect example because my typical beach stroll ended up becoming the 6 levels of communication. So, after I was swimming in the ocean, which I do all the time, I also walk on the beach and pick up garbage, do all those kinds of things. So, after I got home and I was getting a shower to get the sand off, I saw a piece of garbage land on the floor and didn't think much about it, right? Because picking up garbage, I could have stuck it in my pocket, it could have gotten in there while I was swimming, whatever. So, lean down closer, and as I get closer, much to my horror, this piece of garbage has an eyeball. I know, right? So immediately it went from interpersonal communication, talking about what was going on in my head to myself, to taking a picture, texting it to my husband, saying, "Oh my gosh, you'll never believe this." And then sending that same picture in my group chat to all of my friends. And then, of course, posting it on social media. And today I'm using it here in this lecture. And this becomes parasocial when you or somebody else who heard my story tells about it to someone else, someone who doesn't know me. So, one particular example, and we have a million of them, right? This thing that happened to us, our thoughts about it, how other people interacted with us about it, all of the time. So, yeah. So, when I bent over to pick up that piece of garbage, and I don't know if this is actual size on your screen. When I bent down to pick it up, it was maybe a third of an inch long. You can see as I got closer, it was a fish. Yes, I carried them home with me. And I say them because when I found the first piece of garbage and realized it was a fish, I found two more. So I came home from the beach with a grand total of 3 little fish in my swimsuit, which is equally horrifying and hilarious. So, I want to talk about the types of communication. But before I get into that, I want to talk about our classification system. So, in education, we really like to break things down into, this group and this group, and it's really useful for us to be able to talk about them. It gives us a new language. And I remember thinking about it when my kids were little and they were just learning to talk, and we'd go on long walks and they would say car, and eventually I got to the point where I'd say, no, that's a truck or that's an RV. And that classification was useful for them to learn language and differentiation. But today, how many more kinds of vehicles do we have? So SUVs, right, and crossovers and minivans. Where does the minivan fit? Is it a car? Is it a truck? Is it a what is it? And all of us have heard the joke of, being knowledgeable is knowing that tomatoes a fruit, and being smart is knowing it doesn't belong in fruit salad. The ability to classify things helps us to have a greater insight to them. It helps us to simplify them. And simplification can be really good for understanding, but as our understanding deepens and our knowledge grows, then there's lots of blurring in the classifications and lots of overlap. So your book has 4 categories. I have 6. You can decide whether or not mine are useful as we progress. So the interpersonal category is the stuff that goes on in your head. The interpersonal is that stuff that goes on between you and another person. It's one-on-one communication. And interpersonal communication, by the way, is a great freaking class, and I hope that you take it here at College of the Siskiyous. The group republic is one person to many people, which happens, again, public speaking is a common class, one that I love teaching, and it's a way that we communicate information quite a bit. I would throw social media in there as a differentiation, though, because in public speaking, there is a speaker and there is a pretty defined audience. In social media, the audience could literally be everybody. And mass communication, again, our textbook is going to argue later on that all mass communication is social media. Um, but mass communication is something different, right? So if you get that alert sent out to your phone, I'm thinking about the time I was in the Denver airport, and this was at the height of the COVID lockdown, and every single phone in the airport went off saying something like, "You are in the city of Denver. We have a 10 p.m. curfew. If you are found wandering around outside after 10 p.m., you will be arrested." First off, I didn't know that the government had the ability to push out a message to every person's cell phone. This wasn't something that we opted into like the alert system, but that is that message that goes out to everybody. And here at COS, we've asked you to sign up for the alert system so we can send you out messages maybe about financial aid or campus closures or sporting events or other things like that. So that's slightly different than a social media. And then we have parasocial. And parasocial is the relationship that feels real, feels human, but it may be between people that don't know each other or never actually directly communicated. So if you watch the videos where someone is talking about the Reddit forums, "Am I the asshole?" Those are all parasocial communication events. So dividing those up helps us to really think about how we are spending our media time. And again, there's going to be a lot of overlap. In fact, when I was looking at this particular chart, I'm not sure where I would have put listening to music, because if you're listening to it on the radio, that seems to me very different than listening to it on Spotify or even Pandora. And so, would it be in other digital non video? And this particular chart doesn't seem to say. So, anyway, I threw this in there because it talks about some of the different platforms we might be using to access media: traditional TV, subscription, social networks, digital audio, which obviously is going to include things like Spotify and Pandora. But is it different if you're listening to an audio podcast as opposed to listening to music? I'm not sure. So, this gives you some idea of some of the kinds of ways and platforms that we might be looking at media, and that will be super useful to you as you are working on your media tracker. Not this week, but again, last week and next week. So let's move into media literacy and let's be judgy, because that's part of the goal of this course, is to teach you to be able to judge those different forms of content. So I want to start by thinking about the cognitive approach. That is, does this media platform teach us something? How are we interacting with it on an intellectual basis? So I chose for my example the Barbie movie, because the Barbie movie, before people saw it, right? They thought of it as it going to be entirely fluff, right? Even though there was lots of discussion about the fact that this wasn't really a movie for kids. And so when we're looking at media literacy, the cognitive element, the thinking, the intellectual element, it's really important for you to be able to understand and to analyze what it is that you're seeing. And there's also looking at through an emotional lens. I think about when I teach advertising, I look at lots of commercials and commercials that touch us emotionally, whether they make us laugh or cry, touch our hearts. That's an emotional lens. And so we can judge things on that basis. And then there's purely aesthetics. So, again, looking at the Barbie movie, they did a beautiful job making it pretty, right? And so that was something that you could look at and say, and they even played with that idea when they talked to the non Barbie characters, as were they as attractive in a conventional sense. And so aesthetics is certainly an issue. When I was in college, we watched a movie called The Big Blue in a foreign language. And the thing that I still remember about it 7,893 years later was the incredible photography. So sometimes media speaks to us purely on an aesthetic basis. And finally, morals. And this has been a debate as long as TV specifically has been around, is should we be using television to teach people good moral behavior? And if we're not, because one of the things that makes media powerful is when it's crossing lines, when it's edgy, think Dexter. When we're not using media to model good moral behavior, whatever that is, and usually people mean it to mean acting like me. When we're not using media to model good moral behavior, are we teaching people to behave in socially undesirable ways? Not my job to come up with answers to any of these questions, but it is my job to ask you to think about them. So I hope that you're thinking about them. And as we move on, I want to be thinking about if we look at the right way, whatever that is, to evaluate media, then we have to look at, is there one of these categories that's better than the others? And if so, which one is it? Which one is it? Yeah, that's the answer, right? Is that it's going to depend. It's going to depend on what it is that we're trying to accomplish, what our goals are. And if media stayed the same, maybe those answers would stay the same. But the reality is that media is very definitely changing. So let's look at that history. So communication didn't just evolve. Da da da. We'll start in the 12th century when the priests had the OG grapevine where they communicated information using priests from different parishes communicating across vast pieces of land and over time. And then in 1450, we developed the printing press. And then in 1814, look at that big, huge jump. The steam printing press was developed, which meant that not only could we print things for the masses, but we could do it significantly faster. And so those things could be out to every. And then, not that many years later, 30, we get the telegraph. And then the phonograph, so we could record music. And then in the 1890s, we got music. We got movies, talkies. Mm-hmm. So that looks, we looked at what, 400 years there? And this next slide is only going to be 100. So in the 1920s, we got radio. In the 1930s to 50s, we got television. And then in the 60s, we got satellite TV, which meant that we could get things from much farther away than we could before. In the 1980s, we got personal computers. So I want to say in the 1980s, I worked at the largest distributor seller of personal computers in the country. I know you're super impressed. And this still makes me giggle. I would sell computers to people. We loaded the programs via cassette tapes. So I have just a regular cassette player. If you've ever even seen one of those. And then I would say things like, when this works, it's really cool. And people would buy computers based on the me saying that when it worked, because maybe it didn't work when I was showing it to them, it's really cool. And in 1991, we got the World Wide Web. In the 1990s, email goes mainstream. And a bit of trivia for you, the very first head of state to send an email, this might win you a drink in a bar, was Queen Elizabeth. And then in the mid 1990s, we got search engines. And let me tell you, the internet before search engines was a whole different thing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then in 1998, we got Google. And we got Google, and it became a verb. And then in the 1990s, you got online dating, which really revolutionized so many things. So now we're talking about this century, right? So in 2001, we got Wikipedia. In 2004, we got Facebook, and Facebook was, of course, originally developed for college freshmen. So they could see all the other college freshmen and unfortunately rate them. But that was why Facebook was developed. And then in 2005 and 6, we got YouTube and Twitter, now X. In 2007, we got the iPhone. The very first iPhone is now going to be 20 years old. In 2010, we got Instagram, and then Snapchat and TikTok. And then in the 2010s, streaming dominated. So before that point in time, everyone was using cable, right? And then people talked about cutting the cord, and it's going to save me so much money to stream all of my media. And now in 2022, we got AI assistants. And again, so this isn't just that things are changing, it's that the speed of change is significantly faster. So my first slide had 400 years. My second slide had 100 years. My third slide, 22 years, right? And so we are seeing tremendous rate of change, and that has huge impacts. So we went from the 1450s when it was, I'll write you a letter and eventually I'll hear back, I'll get an answer if I don't die first. You probably played the Oregon Trail. Yeah. And then in 2026, it's been 7 minutes. They must not like me anymore. Why are they ghosting me? I had to show you this image. This is Amazon's homepage back in 1995. And this is what internet pages looked like then. Everything was those blue lines with those blue links, and everything was very, very, very text heavy. Yeah. So in our first version of the internet, we were looking at where is anything. And before there were search engines, we had Archies and Veronicas and Gophers. And the internet was computers that were hosted on usually college web campuses, web servers. And so you would go into that web server and be able to dig around if you knew the internet address to get in there. And then when there started being websites, you memorized those internet addresses. It wasn't that you could search for them. You knew that if you were going to go to GeoCities or thepark.com, you knew what that was and you typed it in. And you knew how it was, and you knew through word of mouth, you knew through, sometimes there were directories that you could use, but it was really difficult to get the word out. And then the second version of the internet was Google will find it, when Googling things became a verb, and we saw search engine optimization being huge, and everybody and their brother claimed to know the secret to getting your website listed in the top 10 on Google. Which reminds me, have you ever gone to a second page of search results? Ever? And certainly that's an interesting thought, right? And now we're in the algorithm will bring it to me phase of the internet, which is you don't need to search for a lot of things, right? Your phone is listening to you, the internet sees what you're doing, and it brings you the things that you need. So we have TikTok, we have YouTube recommends, and this is where we're going to get to later on in the semester, the air fryer doctrine. But what we have is we have an algorithm that sees my behavior, maybe geolocates me and brings me things according to where I'm physically located, and I don't need to search for it at all. It's force fed to me, right? So let's talk about the reading. So as we are doing almost every week, there's going to be 1 or 2 chapters to read. And so this week is your first reading, and I want to say this before I even get into it. Chapter 1 in every textbook you will ever read is not going to be great. Chapter 1 is usually built to impress me, the professor, and make me convinced that this is the right book for the class. And usually the authors don't do a great job of adapting to your audiences. And so they tend to be very heavy and lots of complicated concepts. So remember, You're only assigned to read enough to do a chapter note, and especially for chapter 1 in my class and maybe most of your other classes, I encourage you to just skim. So, chapter 1 is what's assigned this week. And let me talk to you about chapter notes. So, I pulled open the book and I found a place in the book that easily, quickly allowed me to do a chapter note. So, this is a section I pulled directly from the book. And you can see in there it's got the bold underlined area. So that's going to be my chapter note. You can also look for the big bold phrases that are highlighted, and then they'll give you enough stuff underneath them. But I wanted something that I could fit on one page really easily for you. And so we're going to be looking at specific categories to go in the chapter notes. So we're going to look for the number and the title and the topic and the definition used in a sentence. Why should I care? And the details. So you can do this either on Google Notes. There's a link for that if you want to do that on your Google Drive. If you want to do it on paper, and I actually encourage you to do it on paper, I think that's a better way to reinforce the learning. There's a blank form you can use in your guidebook, or you can just do this on paper. And then at the end of the semester, if you do it on paper, you can either take pictures of it or hop on a Zoom call with me real quick and show me. The goal of this is not that I can catch you in not reading carefully enough. The goal is that this is going to encourage you to interact with the textbook. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of quizzes to make you read. So this is the way that I encourage you to read. Again, every part of the chapter is assigned, and I only require you to read enough to do a chapter note. Okay, so let's take this page and let's do the chapter note together. You are welcome to do this right along with me and make this part of your chapter note packet, or if you decided you want to do a different part of the chapter, that's fine too. Either way is perfectly okay. So in the chapter section, it says it's number 1. The chapter title is Living in a Media World. The topic is 4 levels of communication. The definition, used in a sentence explained part, is social interaction through messages. Doesn't need to be complicated. Why should I care? As I said last week, this is a question I want you to always ask in every part of your education, not just the reading. But the question is, when I'm reading this part of the textbook, why do I or why should I care about this? How can I use this in my real life? How does this information impact me? And so there's a million different ways of answering this question. Because of what we've been talking about today, I might answer it by saying, well, I can use this information to really critically examine the different types of communication I'm getting and see what categories it falls under. Your answer can be completely different. And this isn't like a right or wrong answer. I'm just asking you to think about the question and put down your answer. Quick and easy. The next question, the final question, is the details. So this is the meat of the chapter notes. So intrapersonal, which is one to self. And again, I put down definitions. If you know what the words mean, you don't need to. Interpersonal, one-on-one. Public speaking, one to a group. And mass communication, one to many. So if you wanted to, this could be a place where you could insert the other 2 categories that we talked about. We talked about, do you remember? We talked about social media and parasocial relationships. So those could be thrown in there if you wanted them to. Not going to test you on it, just something to think about. So that's how you do chapter notes. Now, this is a really good time for me to tell you that I, as a student, always hated when the teacher taught the book. The book is a resource for you to use. I am going to touch on topics that are in the book. I'm periodically going to say, the author and I disagree on this. But I'm not going to talk about everything. I am going to encourage you to look. And I'm particularly this week encouraging you to look at the author's 7 secrets, especially number 7. I think this is really useful for you to know. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm not going to talk about it in my video. I'm going to encourage you, and Rocky's going to encourage you to read it on your own. This week, great adventures, right? So it's paper number 1, and it's going to have its own separate video, so I'm not going to get into it here, but you are working on paper number 1 this week, and that is Truth, Propaganda, and Media Literacy, How Media Shape My Reality. And so we started that conversation here in this video. Your textbook covers it even more. And I want to remind you, don't use AI to write your papers for you. All of the papers in this class are about applying the things that we're learning to your life. AI can't do that for you. So I encourage you specifically to go and look at the video for this paper and to get started on writing this paper. And this week's conversation. So as every week, this week's conversation has 3 parts. Every adventure has this 3-part conversation, and each part is worth 5 points. So the first part is always going to be the same or very, very, very similar, and I'm going to ask you to talk about something in the video. So it can be, after watching this week's video, answer what is one idea, story, concept, example, question, or observation from this week's episode that stood out to you, and why. And from now on out, I'm going to be shortening that to you with just video reflection. Talk to me. This will help me as your teacher to see what you're responding to in the videos, what things that are interesting to you, what things are cool to you, what things are not speaking to anybody. And so I need to look at changing those or leaving those out. So talk to me about what it was and why it stood out to you. It doesn't have to be deep. Part 2 is to begin the conversation. And that's starting with, I want you to think about yesterday. Reflect on yesterday. So yesterday, what did you watch? What media did you consume? What did you listen to? What did you see? What platform, source, device, or tech had the greatest impact? So we're thinking about just one day, and we're thinking about all of the things that you consumed. And I was trying to think, if I were to answer this question, it would probably actually be AI. How might yesterday have been different if that media source had not existed? So, how would your day yesterday specifically have been different? And again, you don't have to write me 800 words or 500 words. I just want you to talk, answer the questions. And then I want you to give me at least a sentence or two reflecting on how deeply media are woven into your daily life. So, when you get up in the morning, do you start by checking your phone? In fact, is your phone your alarm clock? And so to turn it off, you have it in your hand already? Is that how you start your day? I want you to talk about that. And then we're going to continue the conversation. And this part, you're going to come back on Wednesday-ish, and you're going to respond thoughtfully to at least 2 classmates. And again, I'm not giving you a lot of guidelines here. I want you to have genuine conversations. So if somebody said something that really resonated with you, like, oh my gosh, that is exactly the way my day went yesterday, or that was exactly the platform that I was using. Was it a Netflix and chill day for you? And you binge watched hours and hours of the same show? Have that conversation. Or maybe somebody says something that really surprises you and you're like, wow, that's not even something I considered. Have that conversation. Please don't make me put in all kinds of requirements for this. I just want you to talk to each other. Please don't say things like, oh, good post. Me too, dude. Please have a genuine interaction. Doesn't have to be long, but make sure that it's got some actual meat to it. Conversations are encouraged. And so as we start wrapping up, I want you to take something with you. You don't have to change your media habits this week. I do want you to notice them, because sometimes awareness is the biggest step towards understanding. And the more you know, the more power you have over your own life. And before you go, remember, media are the easiest to understand when we stop taking them for granted, when we actually see them. Stay curious. And in case no one said it today, I love you. This has been Let's Talk Turkey with Jayne Turk, and I'm glad you're here.